Good morning, good afternoon, and a good evening. My name is Franz Stefangati. I'm a fellow in the Cyberspace and Future Conflict program here in London at the Institute for International Strategic Studies. Very glad that you're able to join us, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar titled Future US Defense Strategy in East Asia. It's a very pertinent and timely topic for very, very obvious reasons. China and its People's Liberation Army have increasingly become the top pacing threat for the US military, according to US defense officials and senior policymakers in the United States. On the Chinese side, the reunification of Taiwan with mainland China remains an unfinished objective and a matter of core national interest for Beijing, who have stated that they wish to achieve it by 2049, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And there's overall a growing concern of the Taiwan Strait as a potential flashpoint between China and the United States. And there's an intense debate taking place within the US national security community about the future direction of US defense strategy in East Asia. So in this seminar, we aim to critically examine the ideas of one of the leading voices in this ongoing debate in the United States. And I'm very, very happy to welcome Elbridge Colby to this discussion, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and the lead official for the 2018 US Defense Strategy. Bridge wrote a very, very interesting book titled The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. I really enjoyed reading it over the last week. In the book, Bridge recommends the United States maintain a favorable balance of power in relation to China and a strategy of deterrence by denial to increase the prospect for the United States' long-term strategic success in the 21st century. In this webinar, we also seek to examine Chinese reactions and likely counter-strategies to future US defense strategy in East Asia as outlined in Bridges' book. And for this part, I'm very happy to welcome my colleague Maya Novins. Maya is Senior Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization here at the Institute for International Strategic Studies. Maya's expertise lies in Chinese cross-service defense analyses, China's defense industry and innovation, as well as China's regional strategic affairs and international relations. A brief admin note here. We'll chat for about 30 to 40 minutes and then leave about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. If I can ask you to please type your questions in the chat box. We are not going to utilize the raised hand function. So without further ado, let's kick off this debate here. Let me start with Bridge. Bridge, can you perhaps give us a 5-minute overview of your core argument, why Taiwan is so important in your overall thinking, why US defense strategy needs to change, and what you think China's best strategy in a future conflict or future confrontation with the United States will be? Bridge, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Franz. Thank you for the kind introduction, invitation, and thank you to IISS for hosting. It's great to be able to speak to this really expert audience, no doubt, of viewers here about this very important and I'd say urgent and pressing topic, and a pleasure to be on with Maya Owens, who's a real expert on this topic. I mean, as you said, in the book, I try to lay it out in a more comprehensive fashion, but to give you the kind of the elevator pitch, my basic view is that we no longer have, we the Americans no longer have the superabundance of resources to essentially smother all of our various potential threats and challenges in the world with those, the surplus of resources. So we have to make choices. I mean, the simple fact is we are, relatively speaking, we're no longer the unipolar power if we ever were. And in that condition, we need to make choices. And in my view, we need to have a strategy. If you were a business, it would be a similar kind of dynamic. I mean, there's of course China, which is the first genuine superpower. I mean, it's actually going to be a larger economy than the United States by some metrics already, and probably by market terms sometime in the next decade or so. There's also, of course, Russia, there's Iran, there's North Korea, there's terrorism, et cetera. So how do we, as they say in the military, rack and stack? Well, in my book, I try to pursue a deductive approach to this. And my basic argument is that, this is from an American point of view, I would say enlightened self-interest, but self-interest nonetheless, focused on our security, freedom, and prosperity. And the critical predicate for those goods is that no other state be so powerful that it could coerce us over our core interests. And the only state that can plausibly do that would be China, by establishing a regionally hegemonic position over Asia, because Asia is by far the world's most important area now. It's going to be roughly 50% of global GDP, and that share is growing. And China is the only state in the international system that could plausibly attain that predominant position in one of the world's key regions. Russia is too weak to do so in Europe, and Europe itself is only around roughly 25% of global GDP. The rest of the regions, their fates, essentially from a geopolitical point of view, will be determined by the outcome in the primary theater. So if that's the case, China does appear to be pursuing regional hegemony, and I mean, we can go into it. It certainly seems to be happening in front of our eyes. If that's their goal, how do we blunt that aspiration? Well, we can't do it by ourselves for various reasons. Most importantly, we just don't have the combination of power and resolve. So we need a balancing coalition, what I call an anti-hegemonic coalition. Sounds good, and in some ways it's actually happening now. The problem is China has a natural strategy to be able to defeat the efficacy of that anti-hegemonic coalition. And I call this the focused and sequential strategy, that basically, rather than precipitating a sort of 360-degree conflict, as say Adolf Hitler did in 1942, China's incentive is to kind of try to short circuit or undermine that aborting coalition by going after its weaker members and essentially causing a run on the bank, undermining the confidence in that coalition. China's best way to do that, in my view, is that we need to prepare for China's best strategy, because that's its most gainful and therefore in practical terms its most dangerous, is actually to use military force, particularly by fait accompli, against the more vulnerable members of that coalition, especially the ones tied to Washington. Since the United States plays a critical role in that coalition, since we are in effect the big heavy, there's no way that a coalition could array around other states because they're too weak in the face of China's concentrated pressure. So China's goal needs to be to discredit confidence in the U.S. effective defense. And the way to do that, as I said, is going to be almost very likely with military power, because we can see even today that China's economic and soft power is not enough to attain its goals. If anything, it's probably backfiring. We look what's happening in Australia, for instance, where there's a reaction to China's use of economic power. India, you see similar things. And of course, Taiwan itself. So if that's the case, what's China's best strategy? Well, you don't go after Japan or India first. They're too strong. In the case of Japan, they're too tightly tied to the United States. Rather, you go after the raggedy edge that are linked to the United States. Could be the Philippines, but it's harder to get to. Natural target is Taiwan. Okay, obviously China has a stronger case there, rightly or not. And it's very proximate, so it has a lot of military advantages. China's been pursuing this for 25 years. From the US perspective, we are far better off if China cannot attain that goal. While we have a policy of strategic ambiguity notionally, in effect, everybody who matters in Asia, most people who matter in Asia, security decision makers regard Taiwan as a bellwether of American commitment, and not unreasonably. If you're in Manila, or let alone in Hanoi or Jakarta, or even in Seoul or Tokyo, it's reasonable to think how the Americans regard the defense of Taiwan as an indicator of how they would regard defending you, when circumstances resemble the situation over Taiwan, as they very likely will, given the trajectory of the development of Chinese military power, which is extremely formidable and is not just an A2AD military, but increasingly a power projection military, first through the region and then globally. The way to deal with this for us is not to put too much pressure on our resolve, but rather to be able to seek to deny China. We'd be very clear about what our goal is. We are trying to deny China its objective of subordinating one of the members of our anti-hegemonic coalition, especially ones that are tied to us particularly. We don't need to defeat China. We don't need to dismember it. We don't need to become a democracy. We just need to defeat their theory of victory. Think Britain in 1940. As Dowding said, we don't need to defeat Germany. We just need to defeat the invasion. We'll worry about that later. And that's the goal. It is feasible. We are not sufficiently focused on it. And it is increasingly an urgent problem, because China has now the will, of course, to unify with Taiwan, both for revanchist, but also, in my view, geopolitical reasons. It increasingly has the capability. It's hard to know exactly where they are, but they're certainly nearing it. And third, it may have a window of opportunity problem, which tends to be a precipitant for major conflict if you look back historically, because the United States is finally too slowly focusing on China and Asia. Maybe Beijing will see its opportunity in this decade. So At the same time, the implications for Europe and the Middle East are very profound. We have passed the point, in my view, where we can do a graceful, nuanced transition to Asia. The Chinese are too strong and the situation is too urgent. We're probably going to largely have to drop certainly things in the Middle East and largely our conventional efforts in Europe over time. Fortunately, there's a solution to this, which is the Europeans, especially the Germans above all, playing a leading role. You know, the United Kingdom, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Poland are already doing a lot, France. But that's the way that as a global alliance structure, we can deal with these challenges together, rather than trying to drag the Europeans into Asia and a war with China, which I think is unlikely and incommensurate with Europe's threat perception. I think what we want is Europe to take care of its own neighborhood and its own security. We remain in NATO, but Europe essentially bears the primary responsibility for its conventional defense, which of course was the original vision of General Marshall and General Eisenhower. So with that, I look forward to the discussion and to your questions. Thank you.
Before I pass the floor to Maya, let me just quickly pick up on one thing you said, and perhaps you can quickly expand on that. You said, did you foresee windows of opportunity that China is likely going to exploit in, I understand, the short term? Could you perhaps expand on that? Is this because there's a reluctance in the United States to really see this as a problem? Is it a combination of US allies and partners in Asia are not really doing enough here? Or is it really that China is so rapidly focusing on this singular objective of reintegrating Taiwan, so to speak? Could you perhaps expand on that a little bit?
Look, I mean, the reality is I don't know what the Chinese are going to do. I tend to look at this from a rationalistic, deductive perspective. And because of that, I think if there's a more advantageous basis for China to act, I think it's more likely to do so. And I want to prepare against that eventuality. I think I regard the China threat as like heart disease. Yes, it's a long-term problem, but you better get through the short term if you want to have a long-term problem. And I think we're no longer where we were 5 or 10 years, well, really 10 years ago, where we could have done something about it. It's basically here and now. Certainly in the next couple of years, as Admiral Davidson, Admiral Aquilino, and others have made very clear. I would say the reason I'm worried is a couple of factors. One is that the PLA modernization program, dating in some ways from the mid-90s and the Taiwan Straits crises of that period, is already here. I mean, as my good friend and colleague and brilliant analyst Thomas Shugart has pointed out, the Chinese already have the largest Navy in the world. Obviously, the PLAF is the largest regional air force, et cetera, the largest missile force. They have a space architecture. Their capability will improve, but they are already here. Now, the Taiwan scenario in particular, are they there right now, or would it take them a year? I don't know. But in any case, it's a near-term issue. So they've got capacity. They have the will. What are they looking at in terms of result? I think that it's clear that hide and bide will not get them what they want, and they really can't go back to hide and bide because everybody's seen what they're capable of now under Xi Jinping, Hong Kong, et cetera, the line of actual control in Ladakh. So they're going to have to use coercion to get people to go along and subordinate their own autonomy to Chinese regional hegemony at the end of the day. And the most efficacious way to do that is force. And force, if you're going to use force, got talking to an Austrian, hat tip to Napoleon, if you're going to take Vienna, right? And if that's the case, don't mess around, right? Which I think if I were in China, that's what I would advise their leadership. And in particular, because I think the main window issue is it's clear that the United States and our allies are moving, but it's slow. So for instance, our defense program, starting under the third offset strategy, I think being intensified and expanded under the national defense strategy, and now in a lot of ways being continued under the Biden Pentagon, we are shifting towards Asia. But a lot of those programs are not going to come into the force until the late 2020s, 2030s, right? So you got a window there, and it's going to be a different situation 10 years hence. Also, the Japanese are finally, way too late and too slowly starting to move on defense spending. The LDP changed in its party platform. So we'll see, but that's going to take a while. The Taiwans are finally, again, way too slowly and fitfully and unevenly increasing their defense efforts and focusing on the direct invasion offensive in line with hopefully the overall defense concept. But again, that's going to take some time. So if you're China, you've got capacity, and there's a very real possibility it's going to get harder. You're going to lose that. And in those circumstances, it may be the rational act, given the overall geopolitical incentives, not to mention the revanchist incentives, to move sooner rather than later. And that's why I'm really worried.
Well, thank you very much for this insight, Bridge. Let me now pass the floor to Maya. I think Bridge laid out a very coherent, concise argument here. Perhaps you can expand on this and offer the Chinese perspective. Is China indeed, in your opinion, seeking regional hegemony, and is military power really as instrumental as Bridge outlines it in his book in order to achieve regional hegemony? And also, do you see a balancing coalition already forming as Bridge already stated in his introductory remarks? Maya, please.
Sure.
The
First,
floor is
let me
yours.
say thanks. First, let me say it's a real pleasure and an honor to be on such a distinguished panel, and also with you, friends, of course. Some great thinkers here. And I have to say, I really enjoyed your book as well, Bridge. It was a fascinating read. I thought it was solidly argued. I think you're spot on to say that Beijing's greatest weakness at the moment, and of course, I think also greatest concern at the moment, is a coalition of countries, like-minded countries forming against it that can cooperate, that can coordinate their China policies and their resolve to push back on some of the assertions and increasing assertiveness that China is posing to them in the region. I think that's absolutely spot on. Now, I think Beijing in the past, of course, has, as you said, tried to pry apart these relationships. And then I think they've done that to a certain extent because we've assumed largely that hollow threats would be followed up on with action. And I think the more research that we do on this, the more that we see that actually some of Beijing's coercive threats have not always resulted in desired policy shifts. So that should add to our confidence that a coordinated action against China and its regional aspirations for regional hegemony could be successful. Now, I think, as you said, that's already happening. I think it's happening, of course, within the EU. It's happening in the transatlantic relationship, as we've just seen today. The EU and the US have agreed to speak and to discuss Indo-Pacific matters. We, of course, have seen attempts at discussing China-related matters more coherently within ASEAN as well, although, of course, there are different considerations within ASEAN that sometimes make that complicated. But of course, bringing allies together in an economic sphere is what we're seeing. And I think what your book does really well is to talk about a little bit how the defense relationships that are currently a little bit fractured, I think, and there's a patchwork of different frameworks within the Indo-Pacific region can be brought together more cohesively to balance against China. And maybe to first talk a little bit about France's questions, is China seeking regional hegemony? I think it's clear that it's seeking to supplant the United States militarily, and in that sense, be able to leverage all means of its power to a greater extent to pursue its own interests. And at the end of the day, Chinese interests are its primary concern. So yes. Second of all, are coalitions forming? I just stated, yes, I think coalitions are forming. I think they're forming slowly, but that brings me to another point. And I think the reason that certain coalitions are forming slowly, the reason that Taiwan perhaps has been a little bit more slow to act with regard to its national defense, and indeed something that we need to keep in mind for when it comes to our understanding of China is something related to domestic politics, right? I mean, it's very difficult, I think, to have assumed that Taiwan under a KMT leadership that is in essence more pro towards engagement with Beijing and building cross-strait relations would have focused a lot more on defense than it had. And so naturally, I think with Tsai's leadership coming on board, that change is starting to take place. And we've seen that most recently as well. Now, the domestic, of course, domestic politics, I think is something that the book didn't address in great detail when it comes to China, but something that I think is nevertheless really important. We assume that China, of course, in its pursuit of regional hegemony, operates from a position of strength. And I think that's to a certain extent true. China is more confident than it's been in recent decades, particularly under Xi Jinping, who now feels that he has the momentum to be able to push forward and reach further towards the China dream and make progress on that front than his predecessors have. And so Heidenreich, you rightly say, Bridge, yes, has come to a slow halt. But on the other hand, I think we sometimes need to limit our understanding, or at least nuance our understanding of how strong China just is. I think to some extent it portrays this confidence and this strength a little bit more than it actually does. It has serious concerns, of course, within the CCP and China about energy crises, about future water and food insecurity, about slowing economic growth, about societal control, and of course about differing centers of power that could prove opposition to the CCP. And whilst the CCP still receives support in China today, I would argue by and large, what would happen in a wartime scenario? How would that support for the CCP evolve? And what would Beijing's reaction and the CCP's reaction to that be? So Beijing, I think at the moment, and the CCP are preparing the Chinese population for just that, the idea of struggle and nationalism as resilience to that struggle, I think is currently being pushed. But I think understanding these domestic concerns is also important because it makes our analysis of how China would operate in pursuit of some of these national security issues slightly different. Of course, in China's mind, the PLA and the CCP are inherently linked. So the PLA isn't just military and isn't just defense, it's political because it is the party's army, the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. Furthermore, we're not talking about a country that sees national security in the sense that we see it. Beijing's view of national security is much different, much broader. It includes everything from cultural to economic and vague statements. And so, of course, regime survival is something that we also really need to take seriously when it comes to understanding the motivations for how Beijing will act. And today, of course, external economic growth and socioeconomic progress is an important source of regime stability for the CCP. But in the event of a limited war, or worse, a protracted war that Beijing loses in, how does that change the thinking and risk calculus around escalation within the CCP, and particularly within one leader in that CCP at the very top? Furthermore, again, on the issue of Taiwan, I'd argue from Beijing's perspective, this is not just a useful chess piece geopolitically or geographically speaking, because as you rightly say, it is, of course, a gateway to opening up and breaking through that first island chain. Of course, understanding that Beijing has written this into party canon and why it's important when trying to think about what failure to achieve success in a Taiwan crisis would look like for Beijing is equally important as well. So would failure to achieve unification by force and suffer consequences of limited war at home be survivable for the CCP? I have my doubts about that. I have my doubts about whether Beijing would be able to return to hide and bide and try another day. I simply think that at the end of the day, an undeniable defeat in the face of the Chinese population, that the CCP then faces potential risk of internal power struggles as a result, and therefore might have very little to lose in escalating a limited or protracted war, potentially vertically as well. I think it also touches then on the point that in the book, we talk or assume at least that there's a rational actor model in Beijing. I wonder whether this assumption is perhaps overstated. One might say that in certain actions in Beijing that Beijing has recently taken, we don't necessarily see the direct benefit to the country or to the party. Some of them seem incredibly counterintuitive, haven't necessarily resulted in Beijing's own stated aims. And so for the CCP, again, coming back to this point of regime survival, I think this is really critical for us to understand. I felt that the book did a really good job of discussing regime survival concerns in a limited war scenario in the European neighborhood between NATO and Russia. But then when it comes to regime survival concerns and regime change concerns in Beijing, it wasn't necessarily considered as strongly. And I wonder, of course, and I'd love to touch on this in the discussion, why that was. Because from my perspective and my understanding of the CCP, this is a party that has very closely watched regime changes in other countries, has very closely watched, of course, color revolutions, and is, I think, to some extent, or at least in some sectors of the party, convinced that the US isn't just out to contain China's rise, but at the end of the day, aims for regime change. And so at that point, I wonder how easy it will be to convince leaders in Beijing that the strategy of denial by defense, defense by denial, is aimed solely at managing China's rise and preventing regional hegemony, rather than dismembering, occupying, or changing its regime, especially if they already believe that those aims exist. And that brings me to my very last point with regards to the domestic, and that is information flows. And again, it's maybe a little bit of a technical issue or a niche discussion at the moment when it comes to this strategy. But I think the strategy that you lay out before coming to a point of fait accompli and denying that, or at least deterring against that from the start, really depends on accurate information reaching the top of the CCP and the Central Military Commission, so that rational decisions can be made. An attack on Taiwan or the rest of the anti-coalition states can be avoided. And what we know from China at the moment, and the system of research and the restrictions being put on think tanks, on academia, and the like, is that this is a highly restrictive environment that they're operating in, and has led certain high-profile thinkers in Beijing to actually publish in Chinese media that the restrictions in their work no longer allow them to accurately and in a timely fashion be able to advise leadership in China on policy matters. And so if this important information today isn't reaching the top, and we can assume that if leadership stays the same and the system stays the same, because as you say, it's working for China, then how do we think that decisions are going to be made in a rational fashion further down the line as well? I think that means that in general, what we need to do, in addition to this public signaling of forming a coalition of like-minded states, is to also do two other things. Understand Beijing's threat perceptions a lot more closely. Secondly, understand its internal dynamics, and in particular those of the party as well. And thirdly, also and ultimately, convey messages both publicly but also not publicly to the Chinese around US and anti-coalition forces aims more quietly as well, so that we're leveraging all channels of communication with China and don't just assume that the worst is going to happen, or maybe we should assume that the worst is going to happen and send those messages anyway. When it comes to the gray zone, and maybe I can just make one small comment of that before I wrap up. I take your point that it's not necessarily important whether China employs gray zone methods against states when we talk about a fait accompli, and that the United States should be galvanizing its forces and resources to actually match that fait accompli and overcome it. But the strategy that you outline, of course, deals specifically and rests specifically on bringing allies together and like-minded partners on board with this strategy. And of course, gray zone pressures by Beijing in Southeast Asia, for example, in East Asia, are of course a matter of real concern for countries and for governments and for domestic populations as well. And so how does not addressing the gray zone strategy then perhaps detract from the willingness to join such a coalition, or perhaps detract from the ability for us to bring all partners and allies that you've identified in your book together successfully? And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Maya. This was a very comprehensive summary and critique of Bridget's argument. Very, very interesting comments indeed. And I'm going to just give Bridge the floor to respond. After that, I do want to move back perhaps to this concept of limited war and perhaps narrow it down to nuclear vertical escalation and this idea of limited war, because what we're really talking about here, should a conflict break out between the United States and China, it's going to be a great power conflict and two nuclear armed states clashing essentially. And I think we should keep that always in the back of our mind. But in any case, Bridge, why don't you respond to what Maya just said?
Great. Well, I want to get to that critical issue and also the audience questions. So I'll just be brief and try to pick out some of the key themes. First of all, thank you, Maya, for your kind words and your engagement with the book. I think one of the key threads in your comments was the demerits of the rational actor model. And my view is that no model is perfect, but if we are thinking about our defense, we need to think about how the opponent would, its best, or the other entity's best strategy is, because for a couple of reasons. the best strategy is the one that's most gainful for it and the most, in practical terms, damaging for us. So for instance, in the book, I talk about a lot of people say with the bridge, this isn't likely. Well, A, likelihood is a dynamic property that is in large part determined by the cost benefit of, for instance, escalation to military conflict. And B, the likely stuff, the gray zone stuff, for instance, sort of by definition is actually not that important, right? What the gray zone is something that doesn't cross a threshold to trigger the use of military force. It doesn't necessarily mean it's nonviolent. It just means it's something that's not that important. And actually what's happening, I think, a lot in Asia is particularly the allies and partners with which we're more likely to be able and prone to be able to work with. The gray zone stuff is actually triggering balancing behavior by China while not actually achieving its goal. I mean, Taiwan's a great example. I don't think there's any way in which China's going to be able to persuade the people of Taiwan to give up their autonomy by overflights or something like that. Whereas it does actually seem to be triggering higher threat perceptions in Taiwan, right? So in a lot of ways, it's actually probably backfiring on the Chinese. And the critical thing on the gray zone point is we're in a situation of limited resources. I mean, Taiwan is a perfect example. I think they spent like some ungodly fraction of their defense budget last year, like over a quarter or something ridiculous, responding to Chinese air provocations, which is insane because it actually makes them vulnerable to the best strategy, which is direct military action. And I think on the rational actor model, I mean, we can always be smarter, but the reality is we don't know what the Chinese are going to do. I mean, we're going to have very limited information given the difficulties of understanding what the Central Committee and the Standing Committee is going to do. They may not know what they're going to do in the future. But if we're not prepared for their best strategy, and they can always adapt to that best strategy, then we'll be in a lot of trouble. If we prepare for the gray zone, this is one of my problems with the gray zone preparation, is if we wear out our force, and then the Chinese realize, oh, if we escalate to military force, they can change to that relatively quickly. They may be able to do so more quickly than we are. So if we're prepared for the rational actor, which is the best strategy, then we should present them with the best set of cost, benefit, risk incentives to stay within a certain parameters. And then they'll, behave in certain different ways. But I mean, I guess the premise is that it's very rare, if almost, very rare to have leaders who are or leading coalitions, especially in conditions of peacetime, that are kind of suicidal, right? So I think if we can present a basic kind of cost benefit, that's our best bet, because we're not going to know how the Chinese bureaucracy is going to really go, or what Xi Jinping's got in his head. And so that's what we really need to be, I think, most attuned to. And on regime survival, it's absolutely a critical thing. I mean, certainly for the Communist Party, but for any Chinese leadership, going back to look at what happened to the Qing and the Ming and so forth, and all the Chiang Kai-shek getting expelled to Taiwan and so forth. So a couple things. First, given that Taiwan would tap into very profound interests and survival issues for the party in the event of a war, what's critical is to deter a war. We need to and that's one of the reasons I think we need to front load as much as possible. So, and the flip side of that deep attachment to the Taiwan issue in a war means they're going to be more cautious about initiating a conflict, because they know that if they get in there and they fail, they're in big trouble, not only internally, but regionally, because people will see that even over a core interest, they can be resisted and they're dangerous. So if at all humanly possible, we need to focus on deterrence, and we're not doing that enough right now. Secondly, even in a war, and I mean, this will be a nice, hopefully, transition, Franz. I mean, it's true that the Chinese, first of all, certainly want us to think they care existentially about Taiwan. And I think they do care a very great deal. But they care more about the survival of the government. They care more about other things on the mainland that they already control that are obviously more important to China than the fate of one alleged province, right? And that's what's going to be a threat. And of course, my book is an attempt to develop, it's very acutely conscious of that. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to how to deal with this problem after success in a denial of defense for Taiwan, to present China precisely with a problem where it says, yes, they would like to reverse the conflict by escalating, but they don't have a good choice, right? They don't have a good option. If they vertically escalate, they will trigger the righteous might, as FDR put it on December 8th, 1941, of the American people, or Clausewitz, the flashing sword of vengeance, right? So they will actually put themselves in a worse position. Or if they horizontally escalate, they will bring in more countries against them. So I think we can do this. And I mean, the basic model I think of is an analog, more conventionalized version of the PD-59 that Carter, which was kind of the Nixon Ford, Carter, how American policy developed in the latter part of the Cold War, which was to have an attempt to use controlled escalation to signal to the leadership on the other side that they will not succeed in changing the local battle, and that they will continue to suffer significant costs that fall short of the existential, but could trigger it if it's continued, and that they are likely to bring more and more parties in against them in a more resolute fashion. And I mean, if I were China, what is also critical here is, to go back to Schelling, is that we give them a graceful exit. So what we might need to do in these contexts, we would not necessarily need to crow. We would maybe need something like a 1953 armistice, or we might even, who knows what are the other things that we could do to satiate or palliate the Chinese sort of pride and reputational concerns. And I think others would be better positioned to suggest what those might be. But at the end of the day, if I think myself, if I'm the ruthless jerk thinking for China, in that context, I would say this is going poorly. It's going to get worse. We need to find a way out. And if the Americans give us one that's sufficiently consistent with our interests, then we should take it. So, I mean, that's the best that we can do, I think, and it's critical. But right now, we're not doing these things, and so this would be a luxurious problem to have. I mean, not the actual war, but if we were actually debating about how exactly to do this, because we'd had denial defense all set up, I'd feel a lot better. But we're not where we need to be.
Thank you, Bridge. You raised a couple of very interesting points here, and I'm going to give Maya a chance also to add to your remarks, and then we're probably going to have 15 minutes of Q&A. But since you mentioned U.S. history and German history, well, particularly you cited Clausewitz, it just reminded me also that Clausewitz was very conscious of the fact that there are certain elements in military conflict, in war, that you can't really control, that are outside of your control. I think he called it the blind natural forces, hatred, enmity, violence, and so forth. And if you think about what Abraham Lincoln said, I believe, about the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, that he truly must confess he didn't control events, but events controlled him. There's obviously always a chance for inadvertent escalation, and that you see some problem also with U.S. Military doctrine in terms of, well, at the operational level, and a certain disconnect to the strategic level here, because to tie to what Maya said about information, if you have, for example, a doctrine of information dominance and trying to cut command and control capabilities within the PLA and Chinese leadership, that you ultimately will have a big problem when it comes to war termination, which is essentially what you talked about in the last part of your remarks here. And I think this idea of a limited war between the United States and China is obviously something that needs to be considered in much more detail, and we don't have the space here, but I think you lay out a very strong case in your book here. In any case, Maya, do you wish to add anything to this, or should I proceed to the Q&A?
No, let's give the audience a chance.
Okay, great. Well, here's one question from one of our colleagues in Singapore, actually, Dr. Samir Puri, who is asking a question. I believe this is, well, directed at both of you, and I think it was partially already answered, and that is, well, actually, I think it's directed at Bridge when I read the question correctly. A question to challenge your assumption around China's desire to use coercive force over Taiwan. Vladimir Putin recently opined that China does not need to use force and can ultimately rely on the economic absorption of Taiwan. Do you disagree?
Well, I mean, like it or not, President Putin is a keen strategist, but I think he's wrong on this one. I mean, I think that we manifestly seen that, and I think that the Chinese appear to have agreed. That's why they're being more provocative towards Taiwan, more aggressive. I mean, essentially, that was the policy of the Kuomintang government under the Ma administration, and if anything, it actually led to the reverse. I mean, independence, let alone status quo autonomy, are at record highs on Taiwan. So, I mean, that's great if the Chinese think that. Actually, I hope they do, but I don't think they do. I think they understand that people on Taiwan have no interest in living under the CCP. And after looking what's happened to Hong Kong, I mean, what person in their right mind would voluntarily agree to believe Beijing. I mean, you'd have to be nuts, and the people on Taiwan are not. They've earned their freedom the hard way. So, I mean, I'm perplexed by their lack of investment in their self-defense, but I don't doubt their treasuring of their autonomy and their freedom.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Tom McCain. This is now for Bridge and Maya. What risks do you see in pressing the regional states to take sides between the US and China, given the reluctance of the ASEAN states to do so? And for Bridge, how would you seek to put in place deterrence by denial without precipitating the war you seek to avoid? I think that's a crucial question, obviously, and I know you probably won't be able to get into too much detail here, but yeah, why don't we start with Maya and then move on to Bridge?
Sure. I mean, I think here the key word is pressing, right? So I assume, and I'm not going to speak for Bridges, but the issue shouldn't be pressing. It should also be aligning and listening and responding and operating according to countries in the region. And again, countries in the region, I think, are keen to find ways to deter China, to respond. Again, I'm going to come back to this, the gray zone operations. Areas like IUU fishing directed by Beijing, or maritime militia pressures directed by Beijing that ultimately might not change the whole picture, and yes, might create some sort of pushback within countries themselves, but also have an impact on the daily livelihoods and have the potential of having a far greater impact on the daily livelihoods of countries in the region. So I think the issue here should be about shared challenges and not dictating solutions to the region. And that's going to be, I think, key and take some real diplomatic skill to do as well.
So, so I think part of the reason that's so critical to defend Taiwan is we need enough states in our coalition to stand strong to outweigh China and its confederates, right? So in very practical terms, if we lose Taiwan and the Philippines to the Chinese kind of sphere, then we will have to compensate with countries in Asia. So we'll have to press the ASEAN states more. So actually one of the reasons to try to hold to our current defense perimeter, which is actually beneficial to us because it's basically at sea and we're not, you know, the American people, it's ground warfare in Asia, get your head examined. So we want to hold the line if we can. It's our strong suit. So we're going to have to press the ASEAN states a lot more, and the threat is going to be much more immediate to them if we don't hold the line where we are. I mean, if Taiwan falls and then the Philippines makes a deal with China, we're going to have a very different conversation with Jakarta, and Jakarta's threat perception is going to be very different. Right now, they're very laid back, and I don't want to be pressed. It's like, okay, great, I recognize that. We're not asking Indonesia to do anything right now, but it's critical. Denial is a way to compensate so we don't have to put as much political resolve on our own, pressure on our own resolve and on others' resolve. So I think the reality is there's certain states, basically the states that are tied to us along our perimeter. Japan, South Korea has already made its bed. I'm sorry, they need to accept that. Taiwan, to some extent the Philippines, which is more about access, obviously Australia. Those are the countries who really need to press and work with us. And India, we just need to do what it already wants to do, which is have a leading position in South Asia and defend itself against Chinese encroachments and aggression. Everybody else just needs to defend himself. For instance, Vietnam. We don't need an alliance. I don't want an alliance with Vietnam. They don't want an alliance with us. Great. They just need to be able to defend themselves. So we're not actually asking them. This is not John Foster Dulles' Pactomania. This is a different, more differentiated course, and we actually want to avoid that outcome. So, but look, my impression is that the ASEAN states are proud of their national identity and their nationalism and their autonomy. Great. Let's help yourselves to stay free. If the Chinese are massively entering Malaysian airspace, that's not good. I mean, did you get free of the British in order to be basically live under Chinese hegemony? I don't think so, right? So to the extent that you want to protect your autonomy and your independence, let's work together. On deterrence by denial, this is a very important issue because we want denial. But if the Chinese think that we're doing what I'm saying, and it's going to take a little while, even if it's more urgent than our current pace, that's going to even push their incentives forward. Now, I don't think they seem to be, if they were really confident, they already probably would have pulled the trigger. So I think we have some time. But this is where my view is, like, for instance, on strategic ambiguity, don't do anything. We're in fine. People who matter in Asia understand that we're connected to Taiwan's defense. I think the Chinese understand that we're very likely to come to Taiwan's defense. Don't poke the Chinese in the eye. I thought it was very unfortunate that Gordon Lubold reported the story about the Marines on Taiwan. The key is to increase Taiwan's defense, but not to provoke the Chinese in the near term. So this is going to be a task for really delicate diplomacy where we need to really put the heat on to increase our defense posture in a very quiet way. And historically, I mean, it's a fraught example, but people bash on appeasement, and obviously at a strategic level, it was a disaster. But my understanding is part of it was actually to buy more time for the British rearmament to go through. I mean, the Hurricanes and the Spitfires that eventually won the Battle of Britain were not available, I think, in 1938, or you know, so sometimes you have to buy yourself some time by a political tack that's different. But we should be clear in our minds, and really what my book is attempting to do is, yes, we need to think about the regional reaction. Yes, we need to think about domestic politics constraints. Yes, we need to think about bureaucratic factors. But let's be very, 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 very clear in our heads what is that we're trying to do in our sort of inside voice. And then we can complicate and nuance. But the first thing is to really be clear on what we're trying to do and how far we need to go. And that's what this book is trying to do.
There's a question actually tied to this very to the last part of your response here, and this is from Alexander Hamilton here. I'm not sure whether that's his real name, but in any case,
I'm honored. I'm honored that Mr. Hamilton was right. A big fan.
And I do know that we talked about this offline already, this sort of questions. I think it's one of your favorites, Bridge here. What are the obstacles of retiring legacy systems, and how should it be done to readjust the US military postures in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I mean, familiar, political incentives, service equities. It takes a long time to develop a lot of military programs. They're complicated, et cetera. We have a limited industrial base, et cetera. So these are all given. My view is that we can change it if people understand the urgency. So if we get a situation where, let's say, you're trying to retire the J-STARS aircraft, which was wonderful in the Cold War and is not suited anymore. The Georgia delegation, where the J-STARS, I believe, are produced and assembled, what have you, they're going to oppose it. But if everybody else understands that, well, if I vote to keep J-STARS, Americans are likely to die on Taiwan, and our freedoms are going to take a big hit. I'm sorry, I just can't do that. I'm sorry, my friend from Georgia. I just can't do that for you. Then that's a different story. And that's the world in which we should be living, which is a much more constraining. And so again, political factors will exist, but the Congress, gets a bad rap. I mean, the Pentagon and the defense establishment, frankly, the administration have not been clear enough about this point. I mean, the other day, David Sanger article, very illuminating, saying literally, speaking for the administration, a senior administration official saying, this is not like the Cold War, it's not going to be a military competition. It's like, well, have the Chinese endorsed that? Because their military buildup and their behavior suggest they have not. So, but if that's the line coming from the White House, why would we expect individual members of Congress to behave differently? So we need to, again, one of the purposes of this book is to be very clear about what the scenario is. I do think members of Congress who are voting to keep, basically in practice voting to block the development of necessary capabilities are putting American lives at risk. I do think that. But on the other hand, they're operating in a political and intellectual environment. So that's what I'm trying to help change.
So we're gonna do two more questions, and I must ask for fairly quick and crisp answers, and then I'm gonna give you the opportunity for some concluding remarks. Here's a question from Professor Driss Larafi, and this is for Maya. How could you actually explain Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea specifically, and the Indo-Pacific region in general? But maybe perhaps let's just focus on the South China Sea here. Is it deeply linked to Beijing's concerns about the fragility of its ballistic missile submarines based in Hainan Island? Is it because they could be more easily detected? Did you have any quick responses here, Maya?
Look, I think this shouldn't be seen just in isolation, right? It should be seen as a part of a pattern of wider activity in the Indo-Pacific. So I don't think we should only look at the South China Sea in isolation. And the broader pattern of assertiveness suggests that there's a greater goal here rather than just a tactical goal. And a limited goal. So in that sense, I think it is about dissuading allies and countries in the region to resist Beijing and fall in line with its interests. And in order to do so, clearly, as we've already stated, coercive measures that are not military have a limited effect. They have limited effect in Taiwan. They've had limited effect elsewhere as well, although they are still serious. And concerning to countries. And so the PLA offers another tool by which to make this clear. Let let's also be clear that using the PLA at this moment provides the PLA with operational experience that it otherwise wouldn't have. And that too should be considered when, for example, thinking about flights that incur into Taiwan's 80s.
Thank you, Maya. And here's one last question for a bridge from Patrick Cronin, actually. Used to work for Patrick many years ago, so very glad that you are able to join us, Patrick. How does persistent Russia-China cooperation complicate our coalition building and deterrence? Great question, I think.
Well, I also worked for Patrick, so we're lucky. He's a great strategist and a great friend. So thanks, Patrick. I should ask you this question. No, I think it's a real problem. The apparently quite deep and even possibly deepening Russian alignment with China is immensely problematic, particularly because it presents a simultaneous challenge, especially in Europe. I mean, I think the effects in Asia are rather limited, other than our sort of self-harm through things like CATSA, which is a ridiculous idea, and we should, of course, not do it to India or anybody else. But you know, I mean, the question to me is, we would like to sort of disalign China with Russia. It doesn't mean we need to become allies, but you know, people mock the reverse Kissinger, but we do want a reverse Kissinger. We want the Chinese to have to worry about their northern border like the Soviets had to worry about the Far East. The question, though, is how, and you know, so Asia is the primary theater. So, you know, in principle, you could imagine making concessions, but the problem is, I'm not at all persuaded that pure concessions actually works. In fact, it might backfire with the Russians, who seem to be on their sort of high horse right now, or are kind of in high, you know, they're on the high, things are going well. They think things are going well geopolitically. So I think my sense, and my good friend and my partner, Wes Mitchell, has a great piece out in the last National Interest about how we might negotiate this, that essentially I think it makes a lot of sense in Europe, hold the line, and particularly have Europe take more responsibility for its conventional defense in particular. You know, don't stab the Russians in the face, but don't give. And Wes always points out that we've tried to reset several times and it hasn't worked. So, you know, and then in the East, pursue a different policy, differentiate our Russia policy in the East, and in fact, encourage the Japanese, the Indians, the Vietnamese, the Koreans to say invest and work with Russia, because I think our interests are aligned, because the Russians have enormous vulnerability, not only in the Russian Far East, but in Central Asia, which is their traditional bailiwick, obviously, where the Chinese are going to just inherently become much more influential. So there's a natural conflict, but obviously the Russians are their primary view is West. But if we can try to complicate that picture and nuance it, if you will, maybe you know, ultimately it's going to be China that's going to change Russia's behavior. It's going to be the threat perceived from China. That is sort of very real. But if we can kind of get out of the way as much as possible, I think that will be helpful.
Thank you, Bridge. And we got about 3 minutes left, so I have to ask each of you to do your concluding remarks in like 1 minute and 30 seconds each. And perhaps my last and final question, maybe you can give me a 60-second summary here, is just for the benefit of the audience as well. So just to sum up everything we talked about, do you think the risk of the Sino-US conflict in the short and medium term are increasing or decreasing? And any final thoughts you have? We have about 3.5 minutes now. Who wants to go first? Maya? Maya, sure. Please. Yeah.
I certainly don't think that they're decreasing, and that's for a number of points. I think, again, as we've now stated a number of times, the tools that China has at its disposal in order to force a unification with the mainland are, I think, slowly becoming weaker, and will force, I think, in Beijing, the realization that the use of force may be needed at some point. We've already heard them say that. I think we're not there just yet. I think there's a lot of risk calculation happening in Beijing with regards to this. And I think the risk calculus of Beijing hasn't necessarily changed in the last year or so with regards to how successful a PLA attack would be, and how, as Elbridge very clearly and very well describes in his book, how difficult it would be for the PLA to maintain control over an island like Taiwan if coalition forces decided to actually respond effectively. Nevertheless, clearly tensions are running high, and my concern is that there is a lack of discussion about off-ramps. There's a lack of, I think there is a growing need for crisis communication channels between China and the United States. Those between China and Taiwan haven't worked for a very, very long time. So that altogether, plus a more intense presence and assertive presence by the PLA, leads to a greater risk of miscalculation or misunderstanding. So in that sense, I think we're not definitely not in an era of decreasing risk.
Well, first of all, thank you, Franz. Thanks, IISS. Thanks, Maya. It's been great and for the audience engagement. I would say, yeah, the risks are very real. I don't know. I mean, on a trajectory, I don't know if they're increasing or decreasing, but I think over this decade, it will be a significant possibility. I don't know what the probability is because I don't have that level of confidence in my insight, but it's a very real possibility. And the main reason I worry about it is because it actually might be a good idea for them. So that's what really worries me. I would just like to address one of the questions on a couple of the questions on Taiwan. I think our point here is we are not in the business of making Taiwan independent. That is not in the American interest. And in fact, if Taiwan moved in that direction, I think the United States would need to exercise decisive and actually coercive influence over Taiwan. That is not our point here. Our interests happen to align our interests to the American people, and it's not. I would not ask the American people to die for Taiwan's independence. Taiwan has a great situation right now relative to its circumstance. I mean, the American people don't work magic. Taiwan is 100 miles off the coast of the world's other superpower. So if we can work together, and I think that Tsai administration, Foreign Minister Wu, they appear to have a very clear sense that they are not. It is not the purpose here to move to independence. I don't know what their very, very long-term goals are, but it's certainly not in the American interest. And that, lest I be misunderstood, it is very important that Taiwan not push too hard on that. Because in a sense, the way I think about this is defending Taiwan is something like here. I think of it as like a 70-30 interest. If the costs and risks for the American people rise above it, we will have to abandon Taiwan and reestablish our defense perimeter. That would be bad, but it's not an existential good. So Taiwan needs to understand that. I think that leadership in Taipei understands that. But just so I'm not misunderstood on that critical point, our interests are aligned, but up to a point.
And thank you, Bridge, and thank you, Maya. And I should just say, Bridge, this is all laid out extremely well in your book, and I highly recommend it to our audience. It has some great maps in it as well, by the way. Which
great maps, Andy wrote fantastic maps. So,
I mean, in any case, thank you very much, Maya and Bridge, for this interesting discussion. Plenty of food for thought to continue this dialogue on a very pressing and important issue. And yes, thank you to the audience for your interest. And I bid you all a good day or a good evening. And thank you.